Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Kirsten Wiley, and I'm here today to introduce and welcome Dr. Peter Ward, who is visiting us as part of the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. Dr. Ward is here today to discuss the Medea hypothesis: is life on Earth ultimately self-destructive? He points out that life, rather than helping to regulate the Earth's system, does all it can to consume the resources available, sowing the seeds of its own extinction. In contrast to the Gaia, good mother theory, he asks, what if Earth is closer to a Medea, a mother who kills her own children? Dr. Peter Ward's many books include the highly acclaimed Rare Earth, Why Complex Life is Uncommon in the Universe, and Under a Green Sky. He is a professor of biology and earth and space sciences at the University of Washington and an astrobiologist with NASA. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Ward to Microsoft to discuss the Medea hypothesis: is life on Earth ultimately self-destructive? Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I've done several of these book talks at Microsoft. It's always been fun, although in the past they used to have these huge food spreads, and you'd sort of sit there and feed yourself into just getting a nice snooze and hunker down, listen to that talk and eat some more, but that's okay. So I won't fall asleep. I'm drinking tea, and I'll try to make sure that you don't either. This has been a pretty fun, interesting book to have to deal with. Medea, of course, was Jason's wife, Jason of the Golden Fleece, and Jason apparently had only one really great gift, and that was he could make any woman fall in love with him. So off he went and seduced the daughter of the king of Colchis, where the fleece was, ran off with her, and after she fell in love with him because he had no more gifts, things went predictably downhill. He ran off with another queen, so she ended up killing Jason's kids, and in so doing gave herself the worst mother of the millennium, of the Forever Award for planet Earth. So tongue-in-cheek, I decided if we had to have an alternative to Gaia, why not go with Medea? Although a friend of mine, after I gave this talk at the UW, suggested that Medea at least had forethought. She picked up that knife. She was thinking about this, and what I'll try to show you is that evolution doesn't have forethought. In fact, evolution appears to be this great bumbler. And so he was thinking that we really should call it the Mr. Bean hypothesis or go somewhere there. And 2 weeks ago, I had the interesting experience of being on the Art Bell show Coast to Coast for 3 hours, starting at 11 at night and going till 2 in the morning. And I used to listen to this driving across deserts in my undergrad days. You could, out in the middle of the desert, you can hear Art Bell. And I literally had people calling up asking if Medea had anything to do with world governments and black helicopters. And chemtrails, which I'd never heard about. These are like contrails. Well, these people think that some people are putting poison in the contrails of jets to poison us, called chemtrails. And I'd never heard about this. So those are really Medeans, and let's sort of launch into this and ask how Medean are things. So today's presentation, not tonight, we'll talk a little bit Gaia versus Medea. I want to talk mainly about evidence from deep time, and also how deep time could help us perhaps predict the far future, and also talk about the greatest danger for the near future. So Gaia is really an interesting phenomenon because it began as a hypothesis. Its adherents within 10 years elevated it to a theory. It also became a religion along the way. It did spawn some very useful science, a whole discipline, as a matter of fact, called Earth System Science. And Earth System Science now looks at the way elements move through the various reservoirs of the planet, the atmosphere, the rock reservoirs, the oceans, and life, and in and out. And so forever we should be grateful to the Gaians for at least starting what is really a legitimate area. And every Earth science school in the country now has an Earth System Science course. The genesis is very interesting. Lovelock was a great atmospheric chemist. He was working for JPL and NASA, And he was given early data on the Martian atmosphere, and these data were gathered from Earth instruments. And he was asked to predict whether or not there would be life on it. And he looked at these data and said, nope, there's no life on Mars. This is 10 years before Viking. And when Viking landed, he had a big "I told you so." And the reason he did, he was simply looking at the nature of the atmosphere and said that the Mars atmosphere is in equilibrium with its rocks. Its physical state is in equilibrium, whereas the Earth's atmosphere is out of equilibrium, meaning that if all life on Earth were to die out today, it's kind of like that stupid program, the Earth Without Us, as if we're all going to go away, right? So he says if the life were suddenly to go away, the atmosphere changes rapidly to something else. It moves back towards equilibrium. So life keeps our atmosphere in a state that it would not be without life. And Mars didn't show any evidence of that. So the major aspect of Gaia is that there is homeostasis, that life really does something interesting. It has pretty much, in his terms, has its hands on the knobs and the dials, the active control systems, as it were, to maintain what he calls homeostasis. And the homeostasis is a continuity of those factors which help life stay alive. So life essentially is keeping the planet good for life. And there's a lot of different versions. And really the most important one is number 3 down here, optimizing Gaia. And this is the one that Lovelock still continues to push, that the biota manipulates the physical environment for the purpose of creating biologically favorable or optimal conditions. Now, 1 and 2, influential and coevolutionary, I mean, nobody doubts this, the fact that life influences the rocks and the rocks influence life. They're kind of meaningless. Number 4 is the most extreme form of Gaia, the Earth is alive. Nobody uses the terms yikes anymore. A friend of mine just said yikes, so this is a good yikes. So optimizing is really where you can start testing stuff. And there are predictions that can be tested. We ought to look at biomass through time. If Gaia is correct, then we should see a rather continual or some sort of increase in the biomass. That's the weight of living organisms on this planet, not diversity. Now, biomass and diversity may be coupled, they may not be. And I'll make an argument that they're not coupled, but certainly biomass through time should be a prediction. Secondly, we should see that the vast majority of feedbacks dealing with systems that affect life should be negative. In other words, if it gets too hot, there should be some system that cools it down. Too cool, some system that warms it up. Too little oxygen, some system that brings up oxygen, and vice versa. Negative feedbacks are an important part of Gaia hypothesis. A third important prediction is that the lifespan of the biosphere will be extended by life. Why would the biosphere stop being good for life? Well, our sun continues to enlarge in the sense more and more energy is coming out of it every second. It is 33% more energetic. There's 33% more energy hitting the Earth from the sun now than there was at the start of our solar system 4.6 billion years ago. So that increasing amount of energy certainly affects the effect of life, and we should expect then that life is going to do something to deal with that little phenomenon. Finally, nature will save us, and Mr. Lovelock himself is coming to Seattle on the 15th. I'm trying to worm my way in to hand him one of my books. It's going to be one of those moments from "it burns." At least I hope that moment happens. His point, and he recently said that the humans are an infection, and that we will go from 6.5 billion down to 500 million in the next 50 years. That's a heck of a mortality. 6 billion people dying out in the next 50 years. But this is his point. He said the Earth, the Gaia of the Earth is going to rise up and disinfect us, we humans. Rather an extreme point of view, and I thought I was kind of dour. All right, let's think about the atmosphere. There's a couple of aspects of Gaia that are interesting here. This is one of the quotes. Is the life of the biosphere regulates or maintains the climate and the atmospheric composition, 2 different things. To me, the atmospheric composition is very interesting if we're trying to look at the amounts of carbon dioxide and the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere. And then he has this interesting quote about being the fur of a cat and all that stuff, whatever. Now, we talk about Earth. Which Earth are we talking about? Because NASA and everybody else is looking for Earth-like planets. But an Earth-like planet, really, I think we're talking about Earth right now. I mean, this Earth that we are sitting in on this beautiful afternoon, why don't we go outside and do this over beer? But we're in here today. So we got this beautiful Earth, right? What about right before the dawn of the ice ages? Is that the same Earth? Or how about 100 million years ago, the Cretaceous? That's a really different Earth. Or 2 billion years ago. When we talk about Earth-like planets, we're talking about today's Earth-like planet. Our planet itself has evolved from uninhabitable to habitable, and many varieties of habitable. Habitable for microbes, but not for animals. We've got these various levels, and the definition of what is and what isn't really needs to be better defined, I think. So some of the really important aspects of Gaian effects are shown here. This might be the single most important, is this examination of temperature. Here we have the start 4.6 billion years ago. The Earth system is formed, and through here it starts out really hot because of all the condensation and the compression of the various material, but very quickly it cools down. And then because of the sun's luminosity, it goes up, 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 up. But there is a difference, it turns out, between what it would be and what it is, and that what it is thought to be the aspects of the Gaian system. And what we're looking at in through here now are ways that life has reduced a very high temperature to keep it habitable. Now, if there are no atmosphere at all, the temperature should be radically different, be very cold. But once you have an atmosphere, you've got some problems because of greenhouse gases. And so the greenhouse gas problem is being taken care of by life. However, what I'd like to point out here is that we have some of these sudden shifts. Here's one down, here's one up, here's one down, here's one up, a little blip here. And every one of those shifts, it turns out, are correlated with major biosphere reduction in the amount of biomass, but secondly, a whole lot of extinction. And we'll talk briefly about those. So the evolution of oxygen in the atmosphere is obviously of prime interest to we oxygen breathers. There is no such thing as an anoxic animal. And in fact, David Catling of the UW suggested that every habitable planet that wants to move to complexity will have to have an oxygen atmosphere, because oxygen is the only really oxidizing material that you can use that gives you enough energy to be an active animal. You could be a microbe, but if you really want to have movement, and to have movement is complexity, you're going to have oxygen. And our oxygen did not come packaged with the planet when it first started. In fact, for the first 2.5 billion years, there was almost no oxygen on the planet at all. However, life invented a couple of really neat new tricks, one of which was photosynthesis. And with that, free oxygen began rising in the Earth's atmosphere. Now, for a long time, every bit of oxygen, as soon as it was produced, was immediately consumed through reduction of reduced minerals, such as iron. We had these beautiful iron-rich seas. They oxidized. We had this very rusty ocean for a long time. But we eventually used up all that stuff, and oxygen rose. And when it did rise, it created probably the single most devastating mass extinction ever, because all life up to that time was anoxic, sulfur-reducing material. This methanogens, these particular organisms die in the presence of oxygen. Only a small select few survives this first initial rush of oxygen. We don't have a fossil record indicator of this mass extinction, but chemically we can show that this is in all probability the case. So this was probably the most devastating event in Earth history, and it is life produced. Now, oxygen through time itself is a very interesting topic. This is the oxygen curve above and the carbon dioxide curve below. For the last 600 million years, here's 600 million years ago. Sorry about the slide, it isn't very clear. 450, 300, 200, 100 million years ago. And we're not seeing a constant oxygen level. Instead, we're seeing a very interesting new set of data. The most interesting is up here. 300 million years ago, oxygen levels in the atmosphere appear to be about 30 to 31% compared to 21% today. That's a whole lot more oxygen. Now, oxygen is a really toxic substance, as we know. You need oxygen to burn up stuff. But oxygen also lets you do certain things at high levels that otherwise you can't. I was a kid of the 50s. I grew up with the great science fiction movies. My favorite was them, giant ants in the sewers of Los Angeles. And you've got these, making those models would have been cool. They're kind of like bulldozers with ant feelers, and they made really strange noises if you've seen it. So somebody's pulling on the levers, but real giant insects did occur 300 billion years ago. And they occurred only because of this really high oxygen. Respiration in insects is through diffusion through tiny holes in the carapace. And unless you have very high oxygen, you can't pull enough oxygen in to support a big body. So we have some pretty good evidence that there was very high oxygen then, and just as things goes up, it crashed back down. And the end Permian and the Triassic were times of the lowest oxygen in Earth history. And in a previous book, I've suggested the dinosaurs were the most consummate respirers in low oxygen of any animal that ever lived. And in fact, dinosaurs appeared, first of all, because of low oxygen. The whole bird system, any bird sitting here gets 30% more oxygen than you or I do because they've got this really interesting one-way system. You know, we breathe in, it sort of gets mumbled around in our lungs and breathed back out. A bird has a tube where it never reverses and has a second auxiliary set of lungs called air sacs. Dinosaurs evolved this in the low oxygen system as a consequence of dealing with very low oxygen. So oxygen has gone up and gone down, and it has had consequences. But more consequential is the curve below, carbon dioxide through time. Because carbon dioxide through time, being the greenhouse gas that it is, really affects the rest of life. And what we're looking at here is high CO2 and then this huge crash. And that crash brought about the longest glaciation in Earth history, 100 million years of glaciers. It ran back up again, then it crashed again, until we're right down here at the present day. This was really cold, and in cold it also caused a great deal of death, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So, the Medea hypothesis, evolution really is a dumb, blundering process, and I was castigated for being unkind to women for going after bad mothers. Why can't it be the bad father hypothesis? We'll do that next week. New evolutionary innovation is likely to kill off incumbents as well as making anything more optimal. Life appears to ultimately reduce the lifespan of the biosphere, and again, maybe Mr. Bean. But here again are some testable hypotheses, especially in dealing with biomass through time and the lifespan of the biosphere. So here's some predictions. The life should ultimately reduce the longevity of any planetary biosphere. We'll go into this as to why. It's happening on Earth because of the wholesale removal of carbon dioxide. I showed you that one graph where it dipped way down. That was a consequence of the first forests. What could be greener or nicer than the evolution of forests? Well, it almost tipped life into mass extinction, killing off everything. So there you go, dumb blundering. We're going to hit 10 parts per million, and we can predict this from a variety of means. When that happens, that's the end of the age of animals. We can predict that the age of animals is halfway over. We've got as much time for animals on this planet as we've had, unless somebody with intelligence evolves and starts engineering things. That should be us. So loss of oxygen happens 20 million years after you lose your plants, and plants will die at anything less than 10 parts per million CO2. And so to me, the only out is the evolution of intelligence, that this should happen on any planet. And unless you get intelligence, your planet's cooked. So that is both a very scary but a very hopeful solution. Now, in terms of planetary engineering, this is two of the scariest things I can think of, but this is the single scariest thing I can think of. Paul Crutzen, who got the Nobel Prize, wants to seed the atmosphere with sulfates. He wants to produce mini volcanoes and send up big jets everywhere and dump out just untold tons of sulfur into the atmosphere. And this sulfur aerosol will do what a volcano does. It will reduce the transparency of the atmosphere. Sunlight will be reflected back in space, and the planet itself will cool. Now, this is a real proposal for real problems because he's very worried about the heating of the planet. What it does do, it reduces crop yields, and secondly, it vastly increases acidification of the oceans. All lakes will totally be out. So this is such a blunt instrument, terrible, scary thing. It's not the sort of engineering that I would advocate to deal with such fixes. So let's look at a couple of Medea events in detail. I want to talk about the snowball Earths, the time that the Earth... Question?
Quick question. You say long-term we should maintain the CO2 levels.
Yep.
But now we're all about reducing it, right?
Oh, give that man a PhD. Exactly. It's the irony of ironies, you know? The long term, we have to maintain CO2. Our job is to reduce it short term, maintain it long term. It's really simple. Simple to talk about. But it's absolutely, you're absolutely correct. It's all about maintaining long-term CO2. Keep it above 10 parts per million, we can live forever. Well, we can live till the sun goes red giant in 7 billion years. So the future, end of animal life on Earth and microbial mass extinctions. Let's look at these. The snowball Earths were very interesting. These happened at 2.5 billion years ago and about 0.7 billion years ago. These were times when the Earth froze from pole to pole. They did so because life evolved this method of photosynthesis. In so doing, it pulled all the CO2 out of the atmosphere very quickly and froze the place. Pulled the greenhouse gases out. We got out of them after 20 million years because volcanic CO2 finally rose to levels that heated it up and it could melt it. So this happened again twice, 2 times when great breakthrough innovations in photosynthesis occurred. When life figured out better ways and quicker ways to get CO2, we crashed into these glaciations. And the third time is when I showed you in the Carboniferous during the giant bug time, when the forests figured out how to use and get more CO2 out of the atmosphere and blundered into these very bad patches. Ice sheets and glaciers are a great thing to have today, but if they cover most of the planet, it really reduces your biomass. And when we had these frozen planets where the oceans themselves are covered, then life must have been reduced to a trickle. Probably it existed only around the volcanic vents. We would have had tiny biomass during the snowballs and very close to planetary life extinction. These were very dangerous things to have happen. Lots of things died out in the Pleistocene extinction. It too was caused by life, and so we can blame all the ice ages on reduction of CO2 because of life properties. So the effects of the snowball would have been a huge reduction of habitat area, a huge reduction in biomass, and certainly would have been great mass extinctions of not just species, but just the quantity of life would have plummeted enormously. So let's look at the mass extinctions themselves, and this is the area of research that I've been working on for a lot of years. We all started out thinking that they were caused by volcanoes blowing up, because again, in my 1950s movies, the dinosaurs would all run through that movie and did whatever they did. You saw Raquel Welch, all that happening. And then some volcano symbolically blows up and either the lava gets them or whatever, dies. So it must have been volcanoes. In 1980, that all changed, of course, with the Alvarez discovery of an impact layer. Here's one shown here, Stevens Klint in Denmark. The very thin red line there is a layer of iridium, shock quartz, and extraplanetary material. A lot of that is the crater, the Chicxulub area. But you see a nice chalk. The chalk in through here is a beautifully rich sea bottom, a late Cretaceous sea bottom. The white stuff are the skeletons of tiny plants, coccolithophorids, which have fallen to that sea bottom. But above that thin red line, there's no white stuff because the plankton is almost totally exterminated. And this is the effect of a large body impact on the planet. Afterwards, though, at the top of this picture, in about 10,000 years, it goes white again. The coccoliths are repopulating the seas. They're almost entirely new species, but life comes back. It's kind of like what will happen when Seattle's hit by that 9 earthquake, right? There's the little red line, all the buildings go down to the ground and the survivors run around. FEMA comes in, puts everybody back up, and there we go again, we're fine. And so you can think of an asteroid impact as one of these very bad earthquakes, and those who survive are wonderful. So obviously this had to be a truth because Hollywood made 2 movies about it. And there is a grain of truth to this, but it became so pervasive as an idea about extinction that we soon, by 1990, blamed all the mass extinctions on impact. And in fact, I gave a talk on NPR just 2 weeks ago from the origins, 3 weeks ago in ASU with Ira Flato. And a science reporter came up to me and said, well, you're totally wrong. We know everyone's caused by impact. And I said, well, not really. So let's look at maybe what they are. Certainly things come down from space and hit us, but the sense was on that very bottom down through here that we could compare and correlate crater size to how much stuff dies off. And so here's the sense that the size of the impactor is up through here, the size of the crater it produces here, and the effects of it devastates life on a continent, devastates world agriculture, most species go extinct, and how often you might expect those in terms of the understanding of Earth-crossing asteroids and material that could hit us. So the big events obviously become more and more rare, but nevertheless they're frequent enough that one could expect that every 500 million years you should have 5 of these things. Now, coincidentally, there were 5 giant mass extinctions in the last 500 million years, so it seemed to make really good sense. So this was the type of diversity through time curve. This is 600 million years ago. We're looking at the Cambrian explosion. These are just animals. This is the rise of animals. We had a constant amount through the Paleozoic. Then about 250 million years ago, this huge mass extinction, a rise, another mass extinction. This is the impact event. But of the other big 5, how many really were caused by impact? The slide's a really excellent sense of how quantitative we paleontologists are. The big 5, 1, 2, P, 3, 4, 5. We're good with numbers. So let's look at some of these. There are big holes on this planet. This is the Manicouagan crater in Quebec. It's well dated at 214 million years ago. That's a 100-kilometer crater. Going back to that 100-kilometer crater on this, most species go extinct. I mean, this is what this prediction is. The Manicouagan crater should have resulted in most species going extinct. And we used to think that this extinction, this Triassic extinction here, was caused by that. However, that extinction is 200 million years ago. Our dating is getting better and better and better, and this is 14 million years before it. And so part of my job with UW was to track down rocks of this age, and we did this in British Columbia, Nevada, and in Europe, and nothing goes extinct. You got a big crater on the planet, and nothing goes extinct. Not even a single species we can find goes extinct. So there's got to be a threshold event. We know that the Chicxulub, the dinosaur killer, is 225 kilometers, and there's a whole lot more energy to produce a 225-kilometer crater than 100. But somewhere between 100 and 225, the effects scale up to kill off a lot of stuff. But what that means is we don't have very many of these impact extinctions. So let's look at a few places where we have worked. This is the Karoo Desert in South Africa, an area where we have the limit between the Permian and the Triassic, which was the biggest of all mass extinctions. As many as 90% go extinct compared to about 60 for the dinosaur killer. This is older, 250 compared to 65 million years ago, and it lets us look at a number of aspects. Beautiful stuff. I got to work out here in the Karoo Desert for 10 years, collected some of these things, big Gorgonopsians. This is the biggest carnivore of the time. That's about an 18-inch skull, so it would have been, about an 8-foot animal. And those of you who watch TV, I know nobody here does, there's a new BBC show called Primeval. And Primeval is pretty cool. It's actually about this hero paleontologist, and he's really great looking. Gets the girl, I mean, that never happens in real life, and he somehow has these strange little holes where these big nasty creatures fall through. So the first episode, one of these things falls through this hole into a supermarket in London. And the first of all, it was pretty peculiar to see what they have in supermarkets in London, but then to see this big creature jumping from aisle to aisle and jumping over aisles, and then he picks up a car and throws it at our hero. So I loved it. It was great. Not realistic, but pretty cool. All right, other big stuff is out there. This is my son Patrick being used for scale. Hold still. Big stuff. 250 million years ago it goes extinct. And this is a huge terrestrial extinction. This is what the world was supposed to have. These are mammal-like reptiles. These are all your ancestors. All those dinosaurs, they were never supposed to happen. Should have never happened. We could have had mammals on the planet 160 million years earlier. We could be all the way to well beyond Alpha Centauri and somewhere out to Orion by now if we'd only gotten rid of that whole age of dinosaurs, but oh no. So along comes this big mass extinction, and for 4 or 5 years, from 2001 to 2005, it was thought to be caused by impact, big impact, except that didn't happen. So let's do a little bit of chemistry. What we find now in every one of the big mass extinctions, except that of the Cretaceous, are what we call chaotic carbon episodes, oscillation between carbon-13 and carbon-12, Well, you know about carbon-14 is dating, but it turns out that carbon-13 to carbon-12 ratios tell us an awful lot about productivity and photosynthesis. When there's a whole lot of photosynthetic plants out there doing their little deal, they use up way more carbon-12. If you've got a lot of carbon-13 sitting out there, the reason you get more of it is plants are really working really hard. So conversely, if we start finding more and more carbon-12 in our analyses, it means that somebody's killed off the plants. And so we have begun looking at various of these mass extinction boundaries, and this is a nasty slide, but we can go through it. So here's that ratio. Anytime it goes this direction, death is stalking the planet, that all kinds of plants are dying out. It goes this way, photosynthetic activity has gone up, biomass goes up, biomass goes down, biomass goes up, biomass goes way down, up, down, up, down. I mean, this isn't like an earthquake that knocks the city down. This is like an earthquake, an earthquake, an earthquake, an earthquake, or an impact, an impact, an impact, an impact, except there's no evidence of impact anywhere. Something has caused 1, 2, 3, 4, about 5 major shocks to the way carbon moves through between living and non-living in such a way that we know that we have eliminated land plant life 1, 2, 3, 4, about 5 times in a period of 5 million years. And then it goes back the way it was before. No swings, and down here, no swings. This was really a shock when these data started getting pulled out of the earth, because it is unlike anything that we had seen before. Does not conform to any known mechanism that we had going, and required to be explained. Now, one way that we finally got at this was to think of a new way of understanding what fossils were present, and this is through a method called biomarkers. Here's our tree of life, and it turns out that cell walls contain lipids that are really tough molecules, and that some specific lipids are specific indeed to major groups, major branches of the tree of life. I mean, here's our 3 domains, the bacteria, the eukaryotes, and the archaeans, and when we come up with some very specific groups, there are long-chain carbon molecules that are entirely specific to that group. Gram-positive bacteria produce this immense thing. Green sulfur bacteria produce this one, isoneurotane. Cyanobacteria produce others. We can get green plants, we can get animals. We have these biomarkers. And the beauty of these is that unlike fossil skeletons, you can get it from very little material as long as you have any organics within your sediment. What you're really looking for is oil. You're going to ancient oil from various aged rocks. If you have any hydrocarbon at all, you can tell what was there. And so this particular mechanism began to be used by paleontologists and geochemists looking at these mass extinction boundaries. What happens when carbon oscillates? Well, we began to find out it oscillated because there was jumps in the microbial world back and forth and back and forth. And the jumps turned out to be highly explainable. The most interesting biomarker to be found all over the planet, it turns out, in the oceans at the end of the Permian, are these two, chlorobactane and especially isoneurotane. And isoneurotane and chlorobactane are coming from these 2 types of microbes, purple sulfur bacteria and green pigmented chlorobiaceans. These are green sulfur bacteria. They have a very specific set of characteristics where they live. They have to have sunlight because they're photosynthetic. So that means if you're in the water, you've got to be in shallow enough water for photosynthesis. The photic zone might be 150 feet deep in really clear water, but it's way shallower in even murky water. 2, no oxygen. You have to have shallow water with no oxygen. That's hard to do in the world's oceans. Matter of fact, you can't do it anywhere in today's oceans. 3, the water has to be saturated in the poison hydrogen sulfide. So if you have H2S-rich water with no oxygen and lots of sunlight, you can get these biomarkers. That's a really nasty combination. And we find this in every ocean at the end of the Permian. And we've begun to find it at every ocean, at every one of these mass extinctions. Now, the implications of this are scary, really scary, and we'll see exactly what it means. This is from the Black Sea. It really was purple oceans. This is coming up from about 15, 20 feet deep. The purple nature of the water is because of these purple bacteria. This poor guy is gagging because of the smell coming out of this stuff. So this is zero oxygen water filled with these microbes, and it's absolutely filled with hydrogen sulfide. Hydrogen sulfide is that rotten egg smell. There's a reason it smells so bad to us, because it's very, very poisonous. So in 2005, my colleague Lee Kump came up with a new hypothesis for mass extinction, that there would be a buildup of hydrogen sulfide on low oxygen bottoms, the deep bottoms of the oceans. But if there were a mechanism by which this low oxygen layer, called the chemocline, would rise to the surface, once you're in the photic zone, you should allow these purple sulfur and green sulfur bacteria to start blooming. They don't make hydrogen sulfide, they eat hydrogen sulfide. But because of their biomarkers, they tell us when zero oxygen hydrogen sulfide water was at the surface. Now the kill mechanism is once you get that stuff at the surface, the H2S leaks out. And H2S is highly, highly toxic to marine invertebrates, to land plants, to marine plants, to everything. 200 parts per million kills us dead. 200 parts per million reduces the ozone layer to zero. And so you start getting UV and UVB smashing the Earth. And the fossil plants from that time show exactly this. We see deformations in the various spore formers indicating high UVB. Here's your kill mechanism. High temperature, low oxygen, H2S, and H2S poisoning. You need less and less H2S poisoning as oxygen goes down and temperature goes up. Nasty. This may have happened more than 10 times in the past. Why did we get low oxygen sea bottoms? We'll get back. Let's look at one more that we've been working on. This is where I will be in about 5 weeks, a Devonian reef in Australia, the Canning Basin. You can think of this, if you've seen barrier reefs, you may be able to see it here, but off in the distance you see it kind of wiggling back and forth. This is the reef itself. If you're a diver, deep waters out there. This is all the lagoon, the shallow water stuff, your reef wall. The best place for diving is right in front of that. This reef is 360 million years old. It has never been changed or perturbed. Now we're down on the water. This is a crocodile-rich river, but they're freshies, so they don't hurt you, unlike the salties, which will eat you. And here we have lots of corals right up to here, and then above here, no corals at all. The reef continued to grow, but the formation of calcium carbonate was made by microbes. All animals died off right about here and are replaced by calcareous skeleton-producing microbial groups. So why is that? Well, here again we find that what has happened, these are corals, these nice humpy corals, and lots of nice animals through here, and right above them, these rocks are actually under fresh surface pure black and black and black. And these are short episodes when zero oxygen water has come up to the surface and poisoned the animals. So the chemocline has come to the surface, and sure enough, we find the biomarkers of H2S-rich microbes present here. So this is, coral reef is as shallow as you can get in the world, and we have these chemoclines coming up and killing off this particular reef in one of the big 5 mass extinctions, the Permian event. So a purple ocean, indeed it would have been. And perhaps during the entire Proterozoic, from 1.8 to 1 billion years ago, the oceans would have been purple. The other event is that once all this stuff started leaks out of solution, it turns the sky green. And hence the title of my book before this one. This is horrific. It could never happen again, could it? I mean, how did it happen in the first place? Well, what happened in the first place is that the Earth, on occasion, produces very short-term moments when deep Earth material comes to the surface. Here's a model of the Earth by a Berkeley group in which they've removed the Earth's mantle in through here. So this is all deep core stuff which works its way through. It takes 20 million years to get from here to here, and then it spreads out. It's not like one single point volcano. These are called flood basalts. You only need to drive to Eastern Washington to see them. Just the entire eastern part of the state covered by all that lava. It was one of these things. They're short term. They only take a few millions of years, but if they're big enough, and Washington State's wasn't quite big enough, if they're big enough, the amount of carbon dioxide that they produce causes greenhouse warming so fast that our polar regions get as warm as our equator. What happens then? There's your end of sailing. No sailboats, because once you've got warm poles and equally warm temperate regions, what drives winds is temperature difference. What drives currents? Temperature difference. With no temperature difference, There goes your currents, your winds. The oceans stop moving. When they stop moving, they lose their oxygen. It starts in the deep ocean first because of thermohaline, which is exporting shallow surface, cold, oxygenated water down to the deep sea. That stops. So they go anoxic first. The nasty H2S bugs grow, and it eventually hits the surface. So this has happened over and over and over again in Earth history. Every one of these red areas is one of these short-term volcanic events. The one up through here, called the Siberian Traps, is the biggest. And although that huge size is pretty huge, it happened over about 2 million years. We can look at carbon dioxide through time and see when these mass extinctions happen, and we can see they seem to coincide with high CO2. We've had these peaks in carbon dioxide. The whole world goes anoxic. The nasty H2S comes out, and boom, dead stuff. Now you can say that, well, I mean, it was the volcanoes that started it, yes, but it's life that causes the kill. The H2S is life produced. This is Mother Medea at work. It's happening today. We're finding hydrogen sulfide eruptions all along the coast in Namibia. The Skeleton Coast from Walvis Bay right up north is rich with hydrogen sulfide because the anchovy has been killed off through here, highly productive, very rich upwelling. Surface plankton dies, goes to the bottom and rots, and causes now this upwelling of H2S. The same thing is happening in Hood Canal. We've also found in the last year that seagrass is no longer growing in the San Juan Islands. And this is a very scary phenomenon that could lead to the loss of an awful lot of economically important fish up there. All right, a new view of mass extinctions. Most are caused by rapid global warming brought about by volcanic greenhouse gas emissions. Stagnant oceans go anoxic. Toxic sulfur bacteria take over. Finally, it comes to the surface and you've got H2S. You lose your ozone, you've got direct poisoning. And what would the movie be? So, how long will the biosphere last? And we're almost done here. Extended by life. Lenton, a Gaian, suggested it is, whereas I would maintain that long-term CO2, as this very smart gentleman back here pointed out, is our biggest problem. So as we head towards the future, we got more and more sunshine heading at us, and sooner or later we lose the oceans. But it turns out that particular event, which was always thought to be sort of the end of animal life, is going to come well after the death of plants. And if we think of an Earth's clock, here we are now in this age of plants and animals, about halfway ticking through, and within 500 million, perhaps at most 1 billion years, we're going to lose plants. The oceans won't be lost to space until 3 billion years after that. So we can think of it now. We have this long-term brightening of the sun. It's funny, it's ironic. We know more about the far future than the near future because the physics of the sun and how it's brightening is well known, looking at main sequence stars. And I like to think of the age of animals as this nice little Oreo filling in the two dark microbial ages, the first and second microbial age. There's the loss of CO2, again, that's really nasty, and the reason is our continents keep getting bigger, but mainly because life has gotten more and more and more efficient at taking carbon dioxide and turning it into calcium carbonate skeletons, which then get stuck on continents and go out of the cycle. We're taking CO2, you need it, and turning it into rocks. And only intelligence could put it back in. So this is a major screw up by life. Long term, if we look at CO2, we go all the way back to 3.5 billion years ago. Almost all of this long-term drop has been the increasing efficiency of life at producing limestone. Almost every bit of limestone on this planet is mediated by life. Inorganic limestone rarely occurs. Life-forming limestone, it just gets taken out of the systems. That's our real problem, is that drop, is to stop that. If we look at biosphere through time, predictions are that the greatest biosphere on the planet was somewhere between 500 million and 1 billion years ago. Not species, biomass. Because of high temperature and high CO2, the microbial world back then would have been unbelievably rich. I mean, if you like slime, this would have been fantastic. Every ocean covered by goo. Huge reefs of this stuff. The land surfaces everywhere that's wet, microbial groups. Animals have eaten all that stuff out of existence. But the amount of weight of life on this planet was in the past. And every current estimate, here we are here, is that we're heading downhill fast. So this is life on an aging planet. And that's a little grim. What's going to happen as this planet ages is we're going to see the tree of life here and cut it down bit by bit. The final aspect I want to talk about is the near term, and this deals with something we all know about, the irony again. Long-term CO2 is our problem, but short-term CO2 rise is where we really have to look at. We are heading to 9 to 11 billion. We are also looking at a 1 meter sea level rise by 2100. You cannot stop that. And that is the most conservative estimate. The IPCC said 59 centimeters. That's nonsensical, totally nonsensical. James Hansen says 2 to 3 meters. That's probably equally nonsensical. But think what a meter sea level rise does. 1 meter sea level rise means the storm surge goes up 4 or 5 meters, but worse than that is salt intrusion laterally. 1 meter up puts salt into fields that don't have it now. 1 meter up suggests we may have a 25% reduction in food area, or at least food fields, agricultural fields, by 2100. So remove a quarter of the food and increase the population by a third. And that's pretty much what we're looking at. So we know it's happening really fast. We are already back to CO2 levels we have not seen in the last 20 million years, and we're rapidly heading back to CO2 levels we haven't seen in the last 100 million years. We should hit that by 2 centuries at the most. The rate at which this is going on is now well documented, and that curve is accelerating. The one good news that was taking place was that comparing temperature rise in every single continent, the only good news was Antarctica. That Antarctica seemed to be cooling. Michael Crichton used that with Senator James Imhoff to say that global warming is a crock. But in Nature, the cover of Nature, just 3 months ago, my colleague Eric Steig from the University of Washington, who was with me in Antarctica up till about, I guess we came back 4 weeks ago, has now shown that Antarctica is warming as well as everything else is warming. And indeed, it was quite sobering to be down there. We were down living in tents for 7 weeks and watching it melt all around you. So this is my next book, and this is no joke. I think this is our biggest problem facing us, the sea level rise, by far. Because last year, we rose CO2 2.1 parts per million. All the work, the last 3 years, you can't escape global warming. We all see it everywhere, and we still went up 2.1 parts per million last year. It's above the worst estimates for IPCC. People thought we were finally kicking in and it's working. Well, it's not working. The biggest effects will be in places like Bangladesh. A 1.5 meter impact, for instance, affects a gigantic land area. They feed themselves currently, but they have 3 crops per year rotating, and every bit of arable land is being used. But the 1.5 meter impact is not, again, it's not the covering by seawater. That's bad enough. It's the salt intrusion. Salt intrusion is where you get nailed. 1.5 meters should really thoroughly reduce the output of the San Joaquin Valley. They're already in salt problems. So we have to move the cities up. We have to move the fields up. Can we stop it? I don't think so. Not with China producing coal-fired plants right and left. Coal is the biggest killer. And it is not driving cars, it's building cars. Energy producers, the power plants, are the worst problem. Here's California. If we went up a kilometer, we're not going to go up a kilometer, but we're going to go up a third of this if we melt Antarctica and Greenland. And even with a third of this, the San Joaquin and the Sacramento Valley are flooded totally. And so we've lost all that particular region. All right, there's a couple extreme views here. Here's one, our final hour, Martin Rees. We're in big trouble, goodbye. But there's another view that what I hope to end here with is one of hopefulness. We see there's a problem. You know, like a bunch of alcoholics, number one, I recognize there's a problem. So the nice thing is that number two, here's us in Antarctica. Gigantic ammonite showed up in my lab yesterday, and this is just part of it. The rest of it spun all the way around through here. there's no reason that our species has to go extinct. I was at a talk at Harvard 2 weeks ago, and one of the speakers said, well, yeah, we're going to evolve out of existence very quickly. No. This is the chambered nautilus. This has been around 500 million years. There is no gene within a species, like there's a gene for aging, there's no gene for species, I'm going to go extincting. Doesn't happen. You can last as long as you keep the conditions livable around you. It's minor tweaks to engineering that lets us keep this planet habitable for a great long time. The near term, we got to get over this CO2 bulge and the global sea level rise that's going to happen. My own sense of it is we're not going to stop the melting of the ice caps, ice sheets. They're going. Because we're trying to bring the rest of the world up to our standard of living. To do that, the only fuel to do it is going to be coal. And no matter if we took every bit of energy in this country, India and China are just going to keep burning coal. They're just not going to stop. So then what do? How do we mediate? How do we make it the least amount of mortality over the next few centuries? And that is the challenge that I think we'll all have to confront. I have an 11-year-old kid. I don't let him go to these talks. He gets too scared. Scares me too. All right. The irony I'll leave you with is that I think we are the only Gaians on the planet, or at least have the capability of being. There is no Gaia. There's a lot of Medeans going on, but if we want to change it and fix it, we have to be Gaians. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you. Questions? There's one.
It probably won't be as intelligent as his. But, one thing I'm curious about that's only partially related to what you were saying is, I mean, you would be doing this research anyway, even if the Gaians weren't out there with their nonsense, because this is the work you do. But it sounds as if you also spend time interacting with, trying to talk to those people. And what I've never found or understood is do you feel like you have any way to talk to them where they slowly, come to their senses? It always seems like it's absolute, non-communication. Okay.
I don't have to talk to anybody. I have never talked to a group that didn't already believe what my point of view anyway. I write these books. Who buys these books? Look at this off. This is not the real world. I mean, let's face it, you're not where I live, University of Washington, this is a different species of not the real world. So when then I go on Art Bell, that's the real world. And they call me up and say that black helicopters are flying over, or they have aliens in their freezer. But what they don't do is buy books. I've got Amazon right on there. I'm looking at the instantaneous Amazon book deal while I'm giving this talk. And if you buy one book, it rises hundreds of thousands. Nothing happens. So I've decided I'm going to I'm doing TV. I have a show called Animal Armageddon. It's on the Animal Planet. And it's the mass extinctions meet dinosaurs, right? That was fun. And nobody watches that. So now I'm going to make video games. No, I'm serious. How do you get the teenagers? They all do video games. What if we did a video game on a sim Earth where you got to build an Earth where you don't cause sea level to rise? You make that technological society without melting the ice sheets. How are you going to do it? I made this challenge at Seattle Center. I got 3 people, very serious people, saying, we really need to do this because I think there's no other way you get to the teenagers. My son doesn't read. He got Spore. I can't get him off the damn thing. But Spore, it's frustrating because it's not the real world. What if we did the history of life with real species, real dinosaurs, and the mass extinctions, and that you got to get past this mass extinction to get to the next level? If you don't, you go back and start over. Let's have real evolution with real species, with real things that really happen. Now, that'd be a whole lot better than taking whatever they call science classes in Seattle Public School, which has no science at all that I can see. Anyway, that's our challenge. Is if we want to engage this generation, you got to do some video games. That's where they are. You got to Twitter it to them. I mean, am I wrong here? That's what they do, right? So it's our challenge as grown-ups to try to educate them in science, keep them engaged in science. Because if we don't produce lots of scientists and engineers, we can't get the CO2 out of the rocks. Then we're really screwed. Question?
You may have heard of Jeremy Jackson at Scripps Institute.
I know him well.
He has a presentation called Brave New Ocean. And at the end of that, he holds out much less hope even than you here, and basically says that all megafauna in the oceans will be dead within 30 years, dominated by microbes, stratified, anoxic, because of the overfishing and the dead zones and the acidification. That all these stressors together make things much worse for life in the ocean than we've previously seen in geological history. What do you think about that?
That's irresponsible. I mean, that is totally, I know Jeremy, and that's a prediction. But it is a prediction that leads to such hopelessness that nobody does anything, right? If it's hopeless, why do anything? And you can't take that point of view. We have all these, there's got to be somebody in here with kids. And if any one of you has kids, then we just cannot take this point of view where it's hopeless. Jeremy doesn't know that. That's just, it's a probability, but it's not totally going to happen. So I just don't think we have to go there. Question?
So you mentioned something in the beginning of your presentation about negative feedback loops, and that's every time I read anything about climate change, and the more I go to talks like this, I'm very puzzled because in my I mean, when you study science in high school, you come to the conclusion that, like, if you were to encounter a system at a random point in time, in all likelihood it would be in equilibrium, because systems don't stay in disequilibrium very long, right? So if you've got your cone or something, you're very unlikely to walk in on it at the exact moment where it's about to topple over, right? And so are we just, is it just coincidence that we happen to be a species that evolved, or that the Earth evolved in this period where it was in fact in a disequilibrium between the 500 million years of slime to come, and in the past, the 500 million or several billion years of slime in the future? I mean, this is the part that I don't understand. There have to be some negative feedback loops somewhere, otherwise, this instant in time would have been even briefer.
Well, there's lots of negative feedback loops, but there's lots and lots more positive feedback loops. And one of the slides I had in an earlier version of this talk was I listed, there's about 15 of them, and it was kind of like looking at the Manhattan telephone book, all this list of stuff. But the feedbacks, I mean, let's look at temperature. The most interesting feedback on the system of all is temperature. We've had pretty constant temperature. How does that happen? Well, if it gets warmer and warmer and warmer, it turns out that the rate of weathering increases. And one of the odd things is if you take a silicate rock, like a piece of lava or a piece of granite, and you weather it, just put water on it, it breaks down several of the minerals, and the byproduct of that is a reaction producing a rock that requires 1 atom of CO2. The more you weather, the more CO2 you take out. So as you weather faster and faster, you're pulling more and more CO2 out of the atmosphere. But what's that do? That makes it cooler. And as it gets cooler, your rate of weathering slows down. Now, volcanoes are always putting up a constant amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. If we get it too cool, it warms back up. So this is a beautiful feedback system. The warmer it gets, the cooler it gets. The cooler it gets, the warmer it gets. That's a beautiful negative feedback system. But what happens to ice now when we warm it? We warm it, ice melts, albedo changes, less light is reflected, it gets warmer, we melt more ice. So that's a positive feedback system, and that positive feedback system is what we're in right now. I think we absolutely have to wear little buttons called Save the Ice Sheets. That's what we have to do. We've never had ice sheets on this planet when CO2 has been 1,000 parts per million, never. We're going to hit 1,000 for sure. The question is, how long can we keep it 1,000 until we bring it down before Greenland and Antarctica go? And if we lose those, 240 feet. If we lose that, all the continental edges, all the coastal cities, they're all gone. What happens to humanity then? Well, we move into higher ground. It's going to be very slow, but nevertheless, we're going to lose most of the regions on this planet that currently are arable because they're all low, very low elevation. High elevation farming is not anywhere near as good. Well, you meant one last thing. You said equilibrium. Well, it turns out that life has kept the atmosphere out of equilibrium for billions of years. So systems want to go back, but they don't. Life is here. As long as it's here, it's keeping that system out of equilibrium. So it doesn't have to immediately go back. I don't think I answered your question, but at least I.
Well, then how is it that we had constant temperatures for millions of years?
Yeah, it's a silicate feedback system. But again, what happened is I told you about the first forests. Well, everything had been nice constant temperature, everything was hunky-dory, and then trees evolve with longer roots. And once they dig deeper, the weathering rate went up 7 times. And once the weathering rate went up 7 times more CO2 got pulled out of the atmosphere all of a sudden, and temperature went crash, and we built these big glaciers, and we had 100 million years of glaciation through the Carboniferous. Oh, what a mess. Because this is stupid life, blundering. Oh, let's be tree. What could be more green than making trees? Let's kill off the whole planet. Question.
We're looking for extrasolar planets. What do you think the odds are that we're going to find purple Earths before we find blue Earths?
Plenty. I think we'll see this type of system over and over. Most of our Earth has been purple. I mean, if we went back from the oceans were purple from 2.5 billion up to 500 million years ago. It was almost always purple. Now, here's a cool deal. Guess what I just learned? You know how fast the spin of the Earth would be if we didn't have a moon? 4 to 5 hours. So 2 hours a day, 2 hours a night, 2 hours a day, 2 hours a night. What's that do to climate? Is the Earth habitable? Does it remain long-term temperature equilibrium with a 4-hour spin? And so a bunch of people right now are trying to figure that little one out. Joe Kirschvink at Caltech thinks, no, a fast spin, you'll go runaway greenhouse. I don't think I quite agree with him yet. But everything else being equal, if you're trying to look for other Earths, and ours has 24 hours because the moon has this gravity on the oceans, it slowed us down, a fast spinning Earth, everything else being equal, is not going to be our planet. It's going to be different. I'm not going to say there wouldn't be habitable, but it's really not going to be our planet. We're just trying to figure that out now. The interesting thing about Earth is that there are far more super Earths than Earths. And the super Earths are really where we should start. It turns out Earth is almost, we're rare because we're so small to be habitable. The super Earths with 2 times Earth gravity, what's that going to do to the biomechanics of all the creatures on it? I mean, that's the cool thing. Start looking at what is biology on a super Earth. Question?
So why so much pessimism on China and India and their coal consumption habits? You think Dick Cheney's like kind of in the running for the new PM of India?
Just because I just did a little research on it, and it turns out that 1 out of 100 Chinese and Indians have a car. So if you want to build cars, you want to sell cars, that's where you sell them.
Well, yeah, that is true. But a lot of them ride, little 20cc motor scooters, that kind of thing. So
Yeah, but also if their standard of living goes to the point, like in India, you can get the $2,000 car, which has no pollution control whatsoever. But everybody wants a car, and it's not the cars that screw you, it's the power plants to make the cars. You need a lot of power to fashion an automobile out of steel and aluminum, all this stuff. And that's where the power plants now are being done. I did sabbatical in Australia. Australia is the biggest bunch of hypocrites on the planet. Australia does not allow coal-fired plants to be built in Australia, but they export every pound of coal to China. And it's high sulfur coal. Because I was there sitting by Sydney watching these ships just pile ship after ship after ship of pure Australian coal right to China. Question?
So you've outlined a lot of challenges that we have coming up. But in terms of dealing with them, what are the things that need to be accomplished? And are there any ways that you have thought of that we could attack this?
Yes. Better living through engineering. And the engineering I'm talking about is Craig Venter style engineering. It's not going to be bricks and mortar. It's going to be biological. The 2 big things challenge us are energy and food. And Craig Venter and his group trying to bioengineer now. I mean, he could build aliens. He's got life going with a 21st amino acid. I mean, the keys to the kingdom are just starting to open up. You've got to engineer. We have to make very large shallow seas to produce lipids to the point that these become fuel sources. Now, the trouble is that, once again, it's reduced organic, and you're going to put CO2 in the atmosphere. But at least we're getting away from digging oil out of the ground. Let's grow it, grow our energy, and grow our food. I mean, these two aspects of genetic engineering are, I think, what we really need to do. But beyond that, we need to start growing as much technology as possible. I mean, turn almost everything into biology. It's amazing what you could grow. You can, with the keys of the kingdom of genetics, you can really engineer a lot of solutions that will help the atmosphere. And I think that's the engineering that I see this century. That's where it has to come from. You know, I spent the last two conferences with Craig, one at Harvard and one at ASU, and spent a couple of days with him. Somebody asked him, you know, you sound like you're God. And he said very seriously, I am God. I don't know if you know this guy. He's really scary. But on the other hand, we've got to do something. And I think this is the way we have to go. I don't think it's going to be bricks and mortar. I think engineering knows what has to be done. It should be biological, or what you guys do. But you guys are going to end up doing biological software. You're going to do biological computers. It's all coming to that. It's just so much better than the metals. It's my guess. Thanks for coming. Sorry to be so long and boring.